Crap here, you can't.
What do you want to talk about, Larry?
This is a clue.
Welcome, everyone. So we wanted to approach the topic of genius a little differently. Does anybody know who Brian Eno is? He's a famous musician. And I heard through Austin Kleon, who's also a famous artist, that when you think about genius, you think about one person. But what they were really encouraging people to think about is where the genius came from. They said the scene in which the genius came from. So you think of the writers in Paris. There's a Gertrude Stein, there's Hemingway, all these people that came together. It wasn't just one person. And so when we thought about who's going to speak about genius, first off, we didn't want it to be somebody in their 20s because we have a lot of young people come up here on stage and talk about what they're doing, or their 30s, or their 40s, really. We wanted somebody that was 80s. We wanted to cross the generation lines. That's actually the hardest thing for us to cross, more than racial lines even, is crossing the age line and getting people on stage that have years behind them. So we saw Leary, we heard about him through this article in one of the local magazines. He's the patron saint of espresso. If you're drinking a tasty espresso right now, you can thank Larry. He brought espresso culture to Cincinnati. But more than coffee and more than, really coffee, Larry's kind of a gardener, I think. And he's created the spaces where genius has flourished in Cincinnati. And so that's why we brought him out. We're having a conversation because that's what Larry's about, is creating spaces for conversations. We didn't want to have somebody just lecture at you and give you bullet points. We wanted to see where this would go. Again, it's a little bit of an adventure. So we're going to go through a few things. We're going to try to hit 5 points. We're going to talk about what genius is, about learning to fly, being a jester, or adjuster, as Larry likes to call it, what true success looks like, and we're going to talk about the heart a little bit. That all makes sense as we go along. But one book that Larry and I have looked at a lot is The Little Prince. And in The Little Prince, it says that adults love numbers. So before I introduce who Larry is, I want to give you a couple numbers about Larry. Larry started dozens of cafes in both California, Ohio, all throughout the Midwest. He's not necessarily started them all, but he's been behind them. He's trained baristas, numerous of them. He reads 3 books a week. He has about 15,000 books. Impressive, right? He has 1 son. He's been married to his wife for over 40 years. He has 3 grandchildren. He hails from Silicon Valley, where he had at least 2 famous neighbors. He prefers his lattes above 5,000 feet. He's crash-landed in planes twice and survived. Speaking of survival, he's survived 3 strokes. And he's the spiritual Sherpa to at least one of our previous speakers, Todd Henry. So I'd like to introduce you to Bobo, as his grandchildren call him.
Wow. Yeah, the Bobo, for you social, cultural folks, it means bourgeois bohemian. How many people have heard of that concept? You've got dinks, yuppies, different kinds of culture class. So I am a Bobo, and one of the things that my grandchildren say, they're like 3, 6, and 10 or so years old. When they're asked about growing up, they say, how come they have to grow up? Because Bobo didn't grow up. And so I still have to defend that thing about, read The Little Prince, and you'll figure it out.
I forgot to ask our crowd something. So on your tags, we're going to start off with what is genius. On your tags, you have a genius is. Would anybody care to share real quick what you think genius is before we talk about it?
Looking at a new light?
Or in a new light. Anybody else? I put Larry. Go ahead.
Constant curiosity.
All right, constant
Wow.
curiosity. We're going to talk about that.
I put my dog.
Your dog is genius. Why?
Just because, animals or nature, dogs, they're just so unaware of all the craziness in the world. So I think they're genius because they don't have any things getting in their way.
Yeah.
Being positive.
Larry, what do you think genius is?
There's where it gets risky. One caveat starting off is when people say, I have a question, and why do I have trouble answering questions, is because I look at the word question, and I see the I in the middle, and I see a quest on both sides of the I. So I ask, what is your quest? What is it that you seek? Let's go on a journey together, over coffee preferably, and see what we find. And then after that journey's over, there's some answers that likely come about. But that's not how I can do it today. I thought about it quite a bit, and I said, is that the desire for wisdom and an authentic life that's of the whole person, the heart, mind, and soul, requires the kind of commitment that this mission or movement talks about. Integrity, friends, hard work, that sort of thing. And if you go on that journey of seeking wisdom and authenticity, we want to call it that, then you ultimately end up paying a cost of admissions where you get, have to become humble. So I think humility and the passion for wisdom have to go together. And the two ways I think I understand that is if somebody goes at great information, knowledge in a deep way, narrow way, they get a PhD, like I think Bertan is here, by the way, my friend of 15 years. Is he here, Bertan? Oh, anyway, 15 years ago, I met Bertan, and anyway, he just got his PhD, so he knows how deep and narrow you have to go to get that award. The people that go wide and thin, the Renaissance, know a little bit about a lot of things. I think either one of those paths end up requiring some humility to say, there's so much more that you don't know than you know. And so starting with that, I think is genius. So people talk about rocket science and brain surgery, those are geniuses. Well, they hopefully know a little bit about one thing, but don't ask them questions about life necessarily. So that's my
Yeah.
take.
We have a couple geniuses on stage, not us, but
Yeah.
these guys right here. Do you want to talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
your dolls a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. For all you can't see them, but these are dolls, but they're unique in that they're called little thinkers, and this one's Nietzsche, and there's
Gandhi.
there's all kinds of, but these are considered in our culture genius thought leaders. And when we get off in deep footnotes about these wonderful geniuses, I often, over a cup of coffee, tell people, I want you to hold the little philosopher like a baby and realize that when they get a little older, someone's going to change their diapers again, kind of a little heads up. But how did they become a genius? And I want to say, by the way, all of these genius philosophers that the Unemployed Philosophers Guild makes these, by the way. It's a little clue. They're all guys. And I think that's really questionable whether that's a fair way of looking at genius. But I think behind this story chances are a mother or a formative, nurturing influence, which was in this generation was more women certainly than guys, said something increasingly positive. You can be creative. You aren't normal. You're exceptional. In a sense, you're my little genius. And so I think in my life, when I've been at different stages of imagining projects that I really loved, believed in, and many men that were successful said, well, what's your business plan and how does this work and all that kind of thing. And they didn't see me as being really a viable, fundable plan. There were women, some exceptional women, that kind of adopted me as a son and believed in me, that said, the world needs what you love, like a little prince. And we believe in you. One of those, when I started a bookstore coffee house in San Jose, California, called the Phoenix, one of those was, there were 3 women set me down over coffee. One of them was a diva, the head of the San Jose Opera. One of them was she was an African-American woman that was the head of the art museum, or at least, or the Children's Art Museum. And the other one was like a social justice farm worker leader that was the head of the Grail movement, which is the same Grail that we have here, if you know that in on the eastern side of Cincinnati. It's a women's worker cooperative thing. They set me down and said, listen to your heart, go and do this, and believe in how valuable it is, how much it can change the world, and be vulnerable. Well, because of that, this 8,000 square foot coffee house came, and thousands of books, of course, and art, and great music, not because I was a great musician or a great artist or any of that, but these people came and said, can we be part of it? We really need this place. And so one of those meetings was in a great coffee house fashion. Allen Ginsberg came to read Hal for this afternoon, and I made Allen Ginsberg an espresso and a carrot juice. And my son's friends found out about that when they were in their teens, and they said, you have to respect your father now because he made a carrot juice and an espresso for Allen Ginsberg. And they were reading Kerouac's On the Road, and so it was pretty cool.
You're talking a little bit about where genius is born. Where is it born?
Well, I think Seth Godin or others are talking about the 10,000 hours doing your homework, committing to something. I think that's really part of it. You have to be intense. And I don't like the word focused because I don't do focus well. Scares me. Like, what do you focus on? Like your depth of field, who do you focus on? I think that certainly there are cultures of genius, like we talk about Silicon Valley, and I know I'll tell this story about Kurt.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I was 17 years old, say almost 50 years ago. I had this 69 Ford van that I was going to take on Route 66, to go see on the road to find out, And I had to get my music thing together, so I had an 8-track tape player that I wanted to hook up to this amplifier and all these speakers and stuff, and I asked my dad, hey, can you help me do that? How do I do that? And he said, I don't know how to do that. And I said, well, you fly like these big airplanes all over the world, you don't know how to hook up And he goes, no, I have people design the airplanes, I fly them, But he said, go ask Kurt, our next door neighbor, he would know how to make an 8-track. And I said, I didn't know Kurt knew how to make 8-tracks. Because I played ping pong with Kurt, who's just a neat German engineer, friend, neighbor. And he liked to sail, and he took me sailing. And so I found out that week that Kurt invented the VCR, when he was after he left Ampex. He invented instant replay, what he's really famous for. He did the electronic communication with the moon landing, the first photos and stuff like that. And I was like, wow, this guy's a genius. I mean, he certainly, absolutely is a genius. So he takes me sailing one time in San Francisco Bay on his Teak Lady sailboat. We're out there, and he's just like a child that loves creating things. He's just having fun. So he says, hey, I'll tell you a story of something I made that's really, really cool. And, yeah, great, Kurt, tell me. So he says, you can take a radio and turn it, and there's a point where it is a null point where it'll point to the radio station that it's transmitting. I said, yeah, I know that. As a pilot, I've played in my dad's airplane. You can turn it, and it points that way. He goes, all right. So he said, I hooked this thing up with some little battery and some motors and stuff to move the rudder of my sailboat here, so that I could tune in a radio station in Berkeley or Oakland or San Jose, and the boat would track. And it's unplugged, and I said, oh, that's really cool, And he said, I'll tell you what else. One night I'm out here, had a little extra wine, and it's a beautiful night, and everything's peaceful. And he says, I fall out over the back of the boat. And I go like, whoa, that's, in the bay, like. And he said, yeah. And if I hadn't have been such a genius, you fall out of the back of a sailboat, the thing just turns in the wind, stops, and you're a little wet, but you swim back to the boat and get in the boat. He said, but because I was so smart, the boat would have kept going to crash on the rocks of Oakland somewhere, and people would have come out saying, this is weird, a sailboat without a sailor, And that would have been eaten by the wildlife in the bay, and nobody would have even understood the mystery. But I was a real genius. And Curry, that's pretty exciting. And he said, so as a genius, I tied my ass to the boat. That's what a sailor does, okay? So you get wet, but you don't die. And so I say, oh, Kurt, that's really wise, right? That's definitely. And so as we sailed and had these conversations, one of the conversations was, because I asked him about why you made all this, and I saw his digital inventions, because he had them in his garage and all this stuff, And I said, this is so amazing, how you can, you had, at the time then you had 2-inch tape, for films, right? You had to cut the plastic actually and glue it together. And here, he's figured a way to do this electronically. It was like magic. And so I said, what do you think about that? And he said, here's what I think about it. He said, your generation is going to fall in love with this, because this and what's coming will do so many things. They'll just fall in love with it. And what's wrong with that, Kurt? He said, well, analog tubes breathe. They get hot, they breathe, there's a life in them. They warm up. And he said, like your airplane, a pressure gauge, fluctuate. I mean, it feels something and responds to it. We're digital, it flashes on and off, and it's this or that. And he said, so your generation will likely lose its ability to actually think creatively, to dialogue. It'll just, and every time I see a little, hey, you like this or unlike this, or a little checkbox, he said, this is the binarification of your brain. It's the root of a new kind of ignorance that you should really be scared about. So I'm like, what could be frightening about my iPhone, Anyway, I saw him just a couple years before he became a great, senior figure at Stanford. And if you Google Kurt Mahine, he's can hear his story, but so I think he was more of a genius for saying to a young teenager, tell this story about the digital dilemma. So I think that's the one genius story. I don't know if that answers
I know.
the question.
I think we got through a couple things here. So you talked
Oh,
about genius requiring humility.
Yeah.
That these geniuses were nurtured at some point in their life. I mean, in this generation, it was likely by their mother. I think that's changing. In my life, as a husband, I feel like my wife's a genius, and it's my job to somehow serve her to be more genius. And so I think that the male-female role is changing a little bit there. You talked about a genius that you've met, so they do exist, Kurt. And one thing that you didn't say that you've told me is that Kurt said that the thing about analog and digital that I thought was really interesting is that digital doesn't dance.
Oh, yeah.
And it feels like the genius has a little bit of a dance. It's a little bit of adventure, going to the areas unknown, but also tying yourself up with a rope just in case. So let's talk about flying. Move away from sailing to flying. Larry and I talked a lot about flying because this is a real passion to him. He's had several planes. His dad was a pilot. His dad grew up on a farm, and he wasn't supposed to become a pilot. He was supposed to become a farmer, but this guy flew into his, up in Minneapolis, Minnesota somewhere. And he just went after it. And let's talk about the wing and the wind.
Ooh.
And I have here the question, how does a genius get over the mountains of life?
See, aren't these nice focused questions? To me, this seems like bait. Like, talk about the wind. Talk about where does the wind come from? Can you see it? Can you know it? The pneuma.
Just get esoteric.
Okay. So, this is a Piper Cub. Many people know it as the first airplane. It was mass produced that many pilots learned to fly in. They started building them in the 30s. And in 1940, my father, who was 12 or 13 years old, was a farm boy, 11 brothers, in a farm in Minnesota. One of these 1940 Cubs landed in his field. And, you'd heard about Lindbergh and these planes like they were like the moon landing. It wasn't like a normal thing. And so this farmer friend gave my dad a ride, and he got to fly the airplane. And so when he landed, he said, I am going to fly airplanes. I'm going to be a pilot. And so all his brothers like, you can't be a pilot. You're a farmer. And so he moved to Minneapolis, got a job at an airport, gas planes, and became a flight instructor. Anyway, moved to San Francisco and ended up over a period of time getting a job with United Airlines, flying airplanes. But he loved small airplanes, and so we had half a dozen different airplanes growing up, and it was very normal. My dad would say, you go out to dinner and you're driving along in your car, and somebody this far across the yellow line is eating food and putting on their makeup or doing something, and they could just easily just come over the line like that. You'd be like flying a windshield, Oh, God, who wants to drive, So we flew everywhere. You flew to dinner, flew to the dentist, because you controlled you had people. If you're drunk, you get it for drunk flying, you lose your license. You get it. It's like not like, hey, it happens. So anyway, 1940, my dad experienced that. In 1968, and I was 17, I went out to the airport. My dad had these planes, but I found a Cub, Piper Cub, that had a big engine because it was like a hot rod. And I said, that's the one I want to solo in. So I soloed in a Piper Cub, Super Cub, they called it. And so that's how both of our and then we flew a lot together, all our lives. About 7 or 8 years ago, my dad was 80 years old. He'd retired at United Airlines when he was 60. And it was like 10 years ago. Yeah. I said, I want to make an epic trip in a Cub. And I bought this 1940 Cub. And I said, they ripped up Route 66, you can't drive it anymore. I drove it in 1969 in a van, But I said, I'm going to go back down Route 66, and I can land on Route 66 to parts like they used to. You could land on the road and get gas at a truck stop. Now you go to jail. It's terrorism. So but there were crop duster strips and all. So I'm going to make this epic trip to go down Route 66 and go back to Palo Alto where I soloed. But I'm going to stop in Scottsdale and pick up my dad because we're going to fly over that mountain together and land at Palo Alto. So my dad was just crazy. This is just the best father-son thing you can imagine, flying. So I pick him up, Scottsdale, the Jet Center, it's very sophisticated, and where they don't like you to prop your airplane, because it's like dangerous. And so my dad gets in there, and I said, do you remember the basic rules, like stick back, brake set, throttle closed? And he's like reliving his teenage experience, right? And looking at the panel, saying, you don't have this, you don't have that, you have everything you need. And there he's flown these super sophisticated airplanes all over the world, And so we flew, we landed in Palo Alto and stuff, and then after that trip was over, he said, how are you going back to Cincinnati? And I said, well, I'm not going back to Cincinnati. Little Prince, I'm going to go to New England, coast to coast, and then I'm going to come down and, well, how are you getting there? And I said, I'm flying all the old routes that you flew in a DC-3. Because those days you couldn't get all the way over the mountain. You had to go through the passes, and stuff. And so every place I landed, I could call my dad and say, remember when you first let me fly? And so anyway, the last, just before he passed, he came out and we got to fly his airplane that he gave me. That was a big, nice airplane. And we flew up to Mad River and landed in the grass. And it was the last time I flew with him. But in that airplane, Rose Street baristas, 10 years ago, we did mile-high latte art, and it's the only time it's been done that we know of on Earth. We took a battery, an inverter, an espresso machine, of course, and a grinder, and a bunch of milk and swimming pitchers, and Les, who started Rose Street, was our barista. And how many people know Les? He's like 6'5", we stick him in the back of this airplane, and he's, battery, okay, Les, you're gonna make latte art, And then JP, who was a barista here that was a videographer, he was the videographer. And so I was the pilot. And so we took off from Lunken in Cincinnati and flew to Athens, and we made 5 latte art and we did some 30-degree, 45, 60-degree banks, which weren't successful. Pouring a 2G or 3G latte, it doesn't work.
Larry, the thing I'm hearing is that a genius doesn't take a conventional path.
I think that's convention. We filed, we like played by the rules. Yeah. Yeah, and anyway, that was...
Talk about the wind in the wing and getting over the mountains and turning off the engine.
Oh, if you look at this aeroplano, see how big the wing is? This is, Piper Cubs were kind of made to learn to fly in and not do great feats. They were simple airplanes. Fabric over wood wings and stuff, And when I came back from Palo Alto, flew up, I came through over Salt Lake and up to Montana that way. So I got to 14,000 feet in a Cub, which is people say, well, I haven't been over 3,000 feet in my Piper Cub, And it's how'd you get it up there that high? Well, the only way you can get it up there that high is to do what the birds do, on the windward side of the mountain. And they circle around, they get the updrafts and stuff, so you go over there and take your time and go up. And so my plane had like 85 horsepower at sea level, probably 40 at 7,000 feet, and about 25 at 12, 13,000 feet. There's no way you could get over the mountain with power. You had to use the wing and get the air currents. And it also didn't have a heater, so at 14,000 feet, it was about 5 below zero probably at the time, and the plane was frosting up the windows, but I'm looking out over the edge of the mountain there, and I don't know what was out there, but some condors or eagles or something, but they're out there just cruising around, and I'm saying, hey, you could learn something from these birds, like the Jonathan Livingston Seagull, if you read that book, he learned from the birds, So anyway, there's no way that I could have gotten over that mountain with power. I had to get there with lift in the wing, and it had to pay attention to the environment, the habitat. On my way out, and it's a non-electrical airplane, so you don't have you hand prop it, you have a handheld radio, which doesn't go very far. And so when I was coming out through New Mexico, I landed at a crop duster strip, talked to the old boys, and I said, hey, I'm going this way or that way. Which way should I go? Well, don't go that way. That's in the afternoon. More guys have planted their lives on the side of that mountain. Go that way, So that's genius.
Yeah. I think what I love about that story about going up to 14,000 feet is that you have to turn off the engine. And so much, I know in my life, when I come up with a mountain, whether it's teaching my first course this week or a project I'm working on, I think that I have to turn on the turbines at full power.
Yeah.
And what we talked about, the idea of a genius, that a genius is lifted up by their community. It's like there's these invisible things, like the Little Prince talks about, it's what you can't see that matters.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that as a takeaway for me, at least talking to you, is learning that sometimes you just got to turn off the engine and see where the wind takes you.
Or just realize the engine's not going to help you.
Yeah. It's like the opposite, that we think we need to hang on, but we got to let go.
We want to power through things and not be vulnerable. And I think one of the landings, my favorite landing for paying attention, talk about mindfulness. I was coming to New Mexico, and when I was calling ahead, you only go at like 25, 30 miles on the radio, and I was listening for the ground, like, hey, it's 10, 15 knots, wind, this and that. So I come around the edge of this mountain, and I'm getting as far as I can go, and they say, truth or consequences, flight, information, wind 35, gust to 42, and I go like, whoa, my plane like flies at 40. So that means I really can't even land. It's just gonna be on the ground and it's gonna take off again because of the wind. So I said, I better really pay attention. So I ended up like landing there and turning on anyway, and just slowly taxiing to the first tie down I could see, where I jumped out like with a rope and tied my wing strut down to the ground, and had to wait to get the other wing tied down so the plane wouldn't fly. But the plane would fly without a motor, just from the wind, right? So I go through all these experiences, escape death, and I come back and I get my plane annualized, where they go through it, make sure everything's fine, and I take it off after they did the annual at Lunkin, big long runway and 400 feet at the end of the runway, and the engine quits. And so the way that the FAA trains pilots is, if your engine quits below certain 500 feet or whatever, you go straight ahead. You start shutting things down, and you do this emergency checklist, because more pilots, when they've turned, have like spun in or something, or just go straight ahead. See, so I'm there like, whoa, straight ahead is like a jet center with jets and gas, and the other left there, it's power lines, and so I said, no, but the wing flies, and this thing I can do a 180 and come back between the runways at least, and I know I can survive. So when the FAA, of course, investigated the accident, it was like Scully, like, you go like, dude, if this guy had listened to you, these people would all have been dead, and a bunch of people in the downtown area would have been dead because he'd have never made the airport. But he understood both engines out, hey, this thing flies, it's got a wing, and it's also a boat. It'll float. So fortunately, that story got out. And but the wing, I took a young guy, my dad used to take all the neighborhood kids flying and let them fly the airplane because he thought that's how he learned to love to fly. So that was part of our family tradition. You take the little kids in the neighborhood flying. So I took one kid here flying one time, and we turned on the runway, and I said, put your hands on the thing and on the throttle and put the motor, but tell me when you feel the wing come alive, when you can feel it. So he's like, I'm flying it, like, well, I'll help you out here, but just fly it, And so anyway, his face, when the wing came alive, his face was just so full of light, it was amazing. And 5 years later or something, I'm just down at some shopping center stuff, and he's like, Bobo, like, I said, oh, you remember my name? He goes, well, it's kind of a weird name. And I said, and he goes, and I also remembered the wing wants to fly. I just thought, wow, you experienced it, and like my father experienced it, and like I loved, so that's, the wing wants to fly.
I think that's one of the biggest takeaways I've taken from our time together. For those of you who don't know, Larry and I have probably spent about 15 hours together in the last 3 weeks, just talking like this. So this is just a glimpse of what we've got to do. We don't have a whole lot of time, Larry.
By the way, he says just talking. And he says that, like, part of the reason I say I'm the juster and the jester is because when people say, like, oh, I was just spending time with my baby. And you go, like, you created this human being, and you have this thing, like, and you seem to minimize that. You need to take a day off and go, like, what is it like to create another human being that's never lived? Don't say just, unless you say it's just, good, true, and beautiful. But anyway, so that's my diversion.
Well, we were going to talk about the jester, but I don't think we have as much time there. So let's see. We were going to talk about success. Got about 7 minutes left.
Ooh.
But I think let's talk about the heart. Let's skip that.
Let's do a quick one on success.
You want to do a quick one on success? Do you want me to read the...
Yeah.
Let's read this real quick. We're going to do that. We're going to talk about success, and then we're going to talk about the heart. Do you think we can do that in 7 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
You promise?
3 minutes for the heart. 3 minutes.
Do you really think you can do that?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
I don't know.
I am like linear and succinct, like everybody knows that.
I think maybe we should just read this parable and let it sit.
Yeah.
Versus explaining it.
Oh, okay.
All right. This is called the contented fisherman. The rich industrialist from the north was horrified to find the southern fisherman lying lazily beside his boat, smoking a pipe. Why aren't you fishing? Said the industrialist. Because I have caught enough fish for the day, said the fisherman. Why don't you catch some more? What would I do with that? You could earn more money, was the reply. With that, you could have a motor fixed to your boat and go into deeper waters and catch more fish. Then you would make enough to buy nylon nets. These would bring you more fish and more money. Soon you would have enough money to own 2 boats, maybe even a fleet of boats. Then you'd be a rich man like me. What would I do then? Then you could really enjoy life. What do you think I'm doing right now? Which would you rather have, fortune or a capacity for enjoyment?
Okay, I got to comment briefly on that. I grew up in Palo Alto.
I knew it.
And I had these friends like Kurt
Dangerous.
who went sailing, who hung out in coffee houses and talked about how technology might actually create relationships and networks that could change the world positively. Okay, these great coffee houses where we had these great conversations like this became expensive dinner houses and technology places, and so the people, for the most part, don't get together and have conversations like this because they're so successful. And my wife, who studied theology, went to seminary, who became an attorney, who did family law and estate trust in Palo Alto, the promised land, handled more successful breakups and got to the heart of, like, what did you want? What was success? And a lot of people just don't know. They know the cost of everything and the value of nothing is one of the phrases that we talked about. So Tolstoy's short stories, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Or, there's some great short stories that can get the basics without getting, is that 2 minutes?
We've got 4 minutes left. But I think what we've talked about a lot is that we don't give ourselves enough time to sit down and ramble and talk and see where we go, see where the rabbit hole takes us. Because we're so focused on making the money or the time, the project, the success.
Well,
we lose sight of what success is.
Yeah, I think you have to, you know, part of the, I'll just say it's the lie, is when I go back to see friends in Silicon Valley, and again, some of these friends are extremely successful financially. One guy had a little sailboat, who had a little coffee house, who's an artist and that. And every year he got more successful, where he didn't go to his cabin that he had in the Santa Cruz Mountains. He didn't sail his sailboat. He got a bigger sailboat. And now I'll just say he became the president of the Specialty Coffee Association. And he got fat from a lot of fancy meals. But I said, do you go to your cabin anymore and read, or do you have conversations that you celebrate? Do you with people? And he goes, you make me very uncomfortable talking about that. And I go, well, I'm so glad you're so successful. So I think that when you go and see those people, and I'm not saying they're all like that, but I said one thing that's really different about Cincinnati, being a nice backwater flyover state, is the number of people that I can go and say, hey, do you have time to have a conversation, or like a cup of coffee, and talk about life? It's a, well, sure. And we need to realize how rare that is today, how endangered those conversations are, because ideas have consequences. One of the books I got over there, Ideas Have Consequences. And conversations of consequence do change people's lives and communities. I think I finished.
I think that's a great way to land the plane.
That was land the plane?
I think it's got to be land
Yes,
the plane.
I landed the plane. One of them there is
9:59.
I landed one of them upside down. It's over there. So that wasn't upside down. Okay.
Well, Larry, thank you for your time. I know that, I got to spend 15 hours with you, so I got a lot out of this.
That's why, by the way, that's why he said you aren't going to present. Because you don't know how to answer a question, and his reputation was at stake in this movement. So he said,
his wife wrote up a contract.
I want to do something, but maybe it's not that.
Yeah.
So he rightly feared me presenting.
Well, I hope you all got something out of this. I know that I've gotten a lot out of it. We don't have enough time for Q&A because it's 10 o'clock and we want to respect y'all's time to go back to work. Thank you for being with us today. Larry's going to be here for a little bit. He's got a bunch of stuff up here that's worth looking at. Lots of quotes like this one on the shirt, and artwork from his son.
Oh, yeah.
Pictures from his flights, a few brochures from previous ventures that he's had.
My son, the junior jester.
But yeah, thank you so much for your time with us today, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thank you.